Thank you for joining us tonight. Tonight's program, The Amazing World of Native Bees with conservation educator Linda Ries, is co-sponsored by the Wood River chapter of the Idaho Native Plant Society and the Haley Public Library. I'd like to just ask you, please hold your questions until the end so that we can get you a microphone and properly capture all the questions. Otherwise, they won't be able to hear you on the tape. So Linda is a good friend of the Native Plant Society and the Haley Library. She has a BS in forest biology from Colorado State University, and she worked for over 20 years as a U.S. Forest Service forester and conservation educator. She helped establish the Haley Native Plant Arboretum in 1996, and if you've never been to that wonderful place, you need to ask us how to get there. And she served on the City of Haley Tree Committee since 2016. In addition, Linda served as Blaine County 4-H leader for entomology, geology, and forestry, and was the Project Learning Tree coordinator for South Dakota. Linda's loved insects. She was just a little girl. So Linda.
All right. So thank you for coming. I'm just so excited to see this group. This is very exciting. A little intimidating, but exciting. So I have to back up. Sure, I loved insects, but it took a while because I used to scream when I was a little girl at red ants. And my mom said, "This is not going to work. We have to do something about this. We have to get you past that." So what she did, I was already in 4-H doing things that weren't, to me, very exciting, like cooking and sewing. But she signed me up for entomology. I had to get over that fear. I had to go chase things that would maybe sting me. But after that, I had such an appreciation. And so sometimes it takes that exposure to make a difference. And I had other events in my life. I actually wanted to go into entomology. I was of the age where you ask the department at Colorado State about entomology, and they say, "Sure, you can work for 1, Orkin, 2, you can do research." And I'm like, I'm a freshman. I don't want to be, I didn't at that point think, I don't think I want to do research. So I went into forestry. It was all good. So, let's see if I can get this straight here. All right, that works. So we're going to talk mostly about native bees. I know a lot of you are lovers of honey, lovers of honeybees. However, remember, and maybe you didn't know it, honeybees are a non-native species. There's only one species of honeybees in all of North America. We're looking at 4,000 native bees across North America, and probably close to 400 in Idaho and the Pacific Northwest. So I think it's really time that we learn a little bit more about them and their function and why they're important. And I know this has been said at other talks, but I just wanted to point out that 75% of all our flowering plants depend on bees. Yes, there are some plants that can self-pollinate, but they usually, because they're not cross-pollinating, they usually can't set a seed that's very strong. So cross-pollination is really critical, and bees and other pollinators are very important. And 1/3 of the food that we eat comes from crops. There's like 100 crops that are pollinated by bees, so it is really important we take care of them. And the native bees, as well as the honeybees, are really suffering. This is just an example of some of the things that we would lose without bees if we didn't have bees. I don't know about you, but I think you can only eat so many, wind-pollinated grains. I would really miss a lot of this. And so what we're going to cover tonight, these are just a couple things we're going to talk about. A little bit about how bees are different than other insects, and some other insects that look like bees, how to tell them apart, a little bit about the anatomy, their life cycle, and we're going to talk about some common bees that you probably have already in your yard or in wherever you live. There's probably some of these bees, and how they feed, where they nest, and their social traits. Again, and why they're so important. And one of the things I thought about it later, I'm like, oh, one thing I forgot to talk about. They're so important in pollinating crops, but there's a lot of native wildflowers that wouldn't be around without native bees. They've evolved together. So if we lose some of those bees, we're gonna lose some of our wildflowers. And then some tips on how to attract the bees to your yard. So I think this is really funny. I didn't do this, I found it on the internet. I think it's actually really funny. The bee, cute and fluffy. Well, I don't know about the cute, but the cute's okay. So basically, compared to a wasp, wasps are almost hairless most of the time. Bees usually have hairs and can be incredibly fluffy and fuzzy. I love this, just want to spread the love. Well, so only bees, not wasps, collect pollen. The reason you have trouble at your picnics, you can't blame it on any bee. It's most likely a wasp going after your meat. And of course, not all bees, only honeybees, and really produce honey. But I love this on the wasp. Long, yellow legs of sin. Maybe that's a little bit, but actually their legs, they even have spikes, and they're part of their defense. Yeah, they're not. Now, there are a lot of times when wasps are very beneficial. So I'm not saying they're always a problem, because they do eat some larvae that can be dangerous or harmful to plants. But there is a big difference. And for the most part, bees don't want to sting you if you encroach on their nest, specifically any social bee, honeybees, and bumblebees. They're going to probably sting you to protect their hive or their nest. But there are so many solitary bees that if you come up to a solitary bee and just kind of put it in your hand and do a little squeeze, you might feel something. They don't want to sting you. We know wasps, that's a different story. And this is just, to show you some of the different wasps versus bees. So on the top, there's a bald-faced hornet. There's a European hornet. There's a German yellow jacket and a European paper wasp, and then the honeybee and the eastern bumblebee. So one of the other things I probably forgot to say, wasps have a skinny waist. They must really want to look really cool. They're skinny waist. Bees are beefy. They have really not that skinny waist. So that's a very easy way to tell them apart. There's a lot of other insects that mimic bees because it helps protect them. So if something looks down and goes, I'm not messing with that bug. The syrphid fly, also called the hoverfly on the left, it does, especially from a distance, it would look a lot like a bee. So flies, one of the things that's really different about flies versus bees is, see those big eyes, and they almost touch in the middle, and there's a short antenna. So all flies usually have those big eyes that are that do that. And the other thing is, if you get close enough, count the wings. Wasps and bees have 2 sets of wings, 4 wings, and these only have 2 wings. The other thing that flies can do, if you see something you think it's a bee and it's hovering, it's probably a fly, because they can hover. And there's a lot of other insects that mimic bees. I don't have pictures of them tonight, but there's beetles. There's a moth that looks like a bumblebee, has clear wings. So there's a lot of really cool other insects. So we're just going to talk real briefly about the anatomy of a bee. So just like insects, all insects, it has 3 body parts, the head, thorax, and the abdomen. And it has simple eyes, which is, it says ocelli. There are actually 3 eyes on the top of its head. And those eyes are used to help them orient. And the compound eyes, those really big eyes, help, I mean, they have, I forget how many images they see, but lots of images. They see light, movement, and so those are really important for them to pick out flowers. The other thing that those eyes help them detect any movement. And if you've tried to take a picture of a bee, you realize if you aren't coming up behind it, it's pretty hard. And especially if you cast a shadow, they're gone. But one of the things that's kind of cool about their eyes is they detect the sharp corners of the petals. And so there's a theory that's why some of the petals are shaped the way they are. There's also known that they can see UV light. So if you looked at some petals with the UV light, you can see what are called nectar guides, because it helps the bee find where the nectar is. And we'll talk about nectar versus pollen later. The other thing, I didn't even know about this until I did the bumblebee survey through the Pacific Northwest Bumblebee Project. And so bees can have either a short or a long tongue. Who would know? Who would even think about that? But the cool thing about it, that's part of their adaptation for different flowers. So if you have a short tongue, you're not going to be able to visit flowers like a penstemon and get anything out of it. So those with a short tongue will go to flowers that are open, like a daisy and aster, and those with a long tongue will go to like a penstemon. And all bees, the bee characteristic versus a wasp is they have hairs on their body called scopa, or sometimes they have a specialized basket to hold pollen. And in general, male bees never bother with pollen. They might eat some on their own, but it's the females. The females are going after pollen to feed the egg, which will develop into a larva. So they're the ones, if you see a bee with any kind of pollen on them, chances are it's a female. 2 sets of wings. This diagram doesn't show it, but the mandibles and jaws. So later on, I have a picture of a leaf-cutting bee, which has unbelievable jaws, and so you'll get why that's an important part. And the female stinger. And the stinger used to be, it's just a modified, it used to be what they used to deposit eggs. And the jointed antenna. So this is a really simple diagram of how they go through life. So it's complete metamorphosis, so that just means they have all the different stages. Every stage looks different. So it goes to the egg, the larva, and the larva, there can be up to like 5 stages of the larva. And then, it doesn't show it on this, but then you go into it's called a pre-pupa, and it's starting to get ready to develop all the different parts of an adult bee. And then there's the pupa and then the adult. And this one, this is kind of a funny one. So this I found, this was actually, people will buy the cocoons and the larvae of either leafcutter bees or mason bees. You can actually order them online. Yeah, but anyway, so I thought this was funny, but the reason I kind of like this, so in the middle is, this larva has been delivered to her mailbox, and then it goes up, and it's starting to develop, and you can see it's been wrapped in leaves, and then it comes out of its cocoon, it mates, and then, note this, just saying, wouldn't want to be a male bee. It's really short. so after they mate, just days later, the male dies. Yikes. And then the female goes to work. She starts to collect the pollen and the nectar, and then we'll go through the next slide. I'll show you specifically how they do this. She's building the nest and getting the food in there for the eggs that she'll lay. And after she's done, then she dies. So, but being a male is not a real treat, I don't think. All right, so I think these are great because they really show exactly what's happening. And this was probably for a mason bee, but it'd be similar to all the bees. So on that top left is the egg. It's kind of almost transparent there, and that big yellow thing. So that's the pollen mixed with the nectar that the bee has collected. And I love this, so it's called either a bee loaf or bee bread. Isn't that cool? I think it's great. So it's a short time after she lays the egg, and it would probably be, depending on the bee, it could be like early summer. So that egg hatches, and right away it has a small mouth part, and you can see on that middle slide, you can see where it's already eating some pollen. And so it'll go through about 4 or 5 times, it'll shed its skin and keep getting bigger. And on the far right top, see the pollen bread is almost gone, but that larva has gotten pretty big. And then down in the middle row, again, it's done, and they say that after it's done with that, it poops. And then it starts to form the pre-pupa, as in the middle slide there. And then it kind of goes these stages. This one doesn't show it, but one of the things that I'll do as it kind of nears the end of the pre-pupa, as it becomes a pupa, what it does is spins like a cocoon of like silk, basically, and it covers itself and it protects it. There's some things obviously can get in and find them, but it helps protect them from moisture and all that. And then as it's in there, in the spring, it will chew its way out of the cocoon and then emerge from the nest. We'll talk about different nests. But you can see on that bottom one that all the parts are there, even though it's all kind of, all right. So bees, just like people, some people love to live in the cities or the high-rises. They love a lot of people. And some people like, I'm just gonna live out in the woods somewhere. And so bees go the full spectrum of living together to living by themselves. So the top one, the eusocial, it's honeybees and bumblebees. And the honeybee, we all know they have a hive, and above ground hive, but they can also, wild honeybees can go find a cavity in a tree and live there too. Bumblebees live in the ground and they build little wax pots, but I have a picture of that. So then there's some that they divide the labor, some of the labor, and that's sweat bees is one of those. Some that have the same entrance to the nest. And then there's aggregations of solitary bees, and one example is the alkali bee. And they have ground nests. So if you go out where there's a lot of open soil and usually kind of a sandy soil, if you see a lot of holes that are bigger than like an anthill hole, then it's probably one of the bees, the ground nesting bees. And then there's the female solitary bees, and the mason bee is an example of that. And they live above the ground. So that bee does it all. One female bee does it all. Goes and looks for the mud, goes and looks for the pollen and the nectar and brings that all back, builds the nest, lays the egg, and then seals it off. So all on her own. So these are two basic type of bee nests. So 70% of bees all bees, nest in the ground. Kind of a surprise, isn't it? And 30% nest in some form of cavities. And cavities could be a lot of different things. It could be, this is a mason bee that's gone into a stem, and maybe she's getting ready to lay an egg or something. But so ground nesting, let's go back to the ground nesting. So they always look for bare ground. So if you use a lot of mulch and you have no bare ground in your garden, you're not going to have any of them. They don't like that. They need some open ground. They like a sandy or sandy loam, that kind of a soil. And this one is actually from the squash bee. And so they go down, and this ground nesting bee puts side tunnels where they lay an egg in each one. So in the gravity nesting, they can be like in stems and twigs. Some of the bees love old bark beetle holes in wood. Sometimes they'll even, we heard about this somewhere, they'll even put their eggs between, like if you have like wood shingle roof, they'll go between the shingles. It's just the right size opening. They'll go in old bricks. Some of them go in limestone. So anything that gives them some protection. And it depends on the size of bee, what size cavity they look for. This is just another example of this is from the alkali bee, the ground nest. So you can see this type of bee went straight down, and then it has some side tunnels. There's some places in the country, in the West, I don't know if they do this in Idaho, I hope they do. If there are alkali bees, they take care of them because they're just such a great pollinator of alfalfa fields. So they actually take care of those nests. And this is just the picture of the bumblebee nest. Those are the little wax pots. So this was all underground, and someone, just take a picture, they kind of move something back. But you can see some of the bees working. And so what the bees will do is they use the nectar, and then they go in, when they find a place for a nest, they love rodent holes in the ground. So those are good sizes for them. They'll start putting in make their little wax pots. And then when they're ready for that, then they'll come back and put their bee bread in there with the egg. And there could be up to like 100 or more bumblebees together. And this is just an example. They've kind of modified it just so you can get an idea. But on the left, it gives you an idea of how a cavity nester that's going into a stem or some kind of a tube or a hole is they'll go in and they'll lay an egg with the pollen next to the egg, and then they'll put a divider. Some, like mason bees, use mud. Some use sawdust that they ground up, and then the leafcutter bees use leaves to cap them off. So we're going to talk a little bit about different types of bees, and I put this in there because we do have to talk a little about the honeybee. So one of the things that's different about a honeybee is they have more of a developed pollen basket. Now, bumblebees do have a pretty beefy pollen basket too. A lot of bees carry the pollen on their bodies, so we'll see that later. The thing about the honeybees is their goal is to build the nest. So they collect nectar, and then they bring it back to the nest, and they regurgitate it and create the honeycomb. And then they use the pollen they've gathered for the food for the larvae that they'll, put in the chambers. But because to them, pollination, well, whatever. I'm more worried about my hive. So surprisingly, they're not as efficient a pollinator as some native bees. So we'll get into that a little bit later. So here's the bumblebee, and there are I believe, about 50 species in the Pacific Northwest. And I mean, I love them. Everyone loves them. But I think what's really cool about them, there's such diversity. Look at the size, from 8 millimeters to 21. So that's a wide variety, wide spectrum of size. And like other bees, they can have a short tongue or a long tongue. So one of the things when we were doing our bumblebee survey is we always had to observe what they went to, because that was a tip, and trying to identify them. And I have some more. I just love them. So I'm not positive, but I think this is hunts. And so we get a lot of these around here with the orange bands. And I love this too because look how hairy that sucker is. Why do you think they want that much? Pollen, but it's on their head and on their back. So probably it helps keep them warm. And they can function at a cooler, lower temperatures than some bees. And if you go up into the alpine areas, there's there's bumblebees up there. So I think that's part of it. And then this is a queen. Queen bumblebees are amazing. So if you're out in the spring, and if you ever see a bumblebee really early that looks like kind of like a little bomber, like a little miniature plane, it's probably the queen that's emerged. They're huge. And the queen is out looking for a place to put its nest. So sometimes you'll just see them not going to the flower, but just kind of flying right over the ground. And so you know they're looking for a place to build a nest. All right, here's the leafcutter bee. I told you we'd have a good slide with those jaws. On the left, look at those. So those obviously are good cutting tools, and there it is cutting the leaf, the little circle out of the leaf. And I'm sure most of you have seen that in the summer, where some plants have these weird little holes in it, on the edge of the leaf. And so those are going to be used for their nest. The other thing about the leafcutter bee versus the honeybee, do you see underneath? I'm going to have to do this. There's some pollen and on the abdomen. Those are the hairs that carry some of the pollen. And there it is, flying with the leaf. Isn't that a feat? I mean, wow. Wow. I wonder, wow, I wonder if I had a stunt bee do that. And then I love the little bee in the nook. We have mason bee houses we put out, when it's warm. We've got them in our shed right now. But when it gets close enough to about 55 degrees, we'll put them out. And it's funny because those bees, when they come out, they buzz around and they do their thing. But then the next morning when it's cold, that's what they do. They're just trying to warm up. And I forgot to say this. The other thing about male bees, they really don't have a very fun life. So the female does everything. It lives a lot longer. And the male bee it's not even able to go to the nest overnight. So it has to find a place to stay. And if any of you saw that wonderful picture that Kristen sent with the advertisement for this talk with the sunflower and the bees, yeah, those are all male bees. They're all male longhorn bees. They kind of gather together, maybe out of security, and that's where they sleep, or maybe even just like on a stem and just hope no one bothers them in the night. So, yeah. All right, so this is one of the bees. I don't think I even knew about a large carpenter bees, but I know they're more common than I realized. When we lived back in Virginia, we would go into DC and we went to the bonsai garden. at the National Arboretum. And the first thing we noticed, we're walking around and they have these big timbers, and then they have shade cloth over some of the bonsai. When it gets really hot, they kind of cover them up. My God, there was these bees like over an inch long, and they were like coming right at you. And I'm like, well, they were carpenter bees. And then they decided, they realized, the Arboretum realized, we need to let the public know they're not going to hurt you. They're the males. They can't sting you. They're protecting the females in the nest, in the wood. And yeah, they were very intimidating. And I think they probably actually hit us in the head a couple times. But they are large, and they are about as large as a bumblebee. And then this is an example of where it's gone into some wood, and it's so beefy, it makes its own holes. These other little bees, they have to find a hole. Not the carpenter bee. That's why they call it a carpenter bee. They actually make a hole, and then you can see some of the egg chambers on some of those tunnels. But they're really cool, and we've seen them. I know we've seen them in Nevada. I'm sure they're here too, but if you see a really big bee that's shiny, not quite like a bumblebee, that's probably what it is. And this is an example of the size. So they're pretty close to, a bumblebee in size. And probably a lot of you have seen these. These are very small bees, but they're always beautiful bees. And the reason they got their name is they actually like salt on, if you have a salty hand or something, they'll come up and try and lick you, I guess. So, but I just love them. I think they're really beautiful, but they're very small. And then sweat bees, because they're so small, they have to find something that's already open, like a pithy stem, because they can't build a big nest on their own. And then this is one of our favorites, and it's something that more and more people are appreciating. It's the mason bee, could be called the blue orchard bee. There's a couple species, but they're all in the Osmia genus. And they can look kind of black, they almost look like a little fly. Some of them are very pretty and are more of a bluish green. They're not too hairy, but they nest above ground. And these are the bees that are now, they're doing a lot of trials with them, and they're starting to build large boxes in orchards. So they're a very early to emerge bee, and they come out just when fruit trees are blooming. And with the problems with some of the honeybees, they think this would be an option. And they're just cool. And they don't sting you. You can walk right up to them. Like, look at this. They're just, I don't know why they're on his hand, but. And the cool thing about mason bees is they are such an amazing pollinator. They're kind of, you might say, kind of messy when they pick up their pollen. Look at that bee. It's got just on his head, it's on his belly. And so pollen, which I think is fascinating, on a bee, there's electrostatic charge that builds up, supposedly from flying. But when they go where there's pollen, it basically just kind of jumps onto them. And but mason bees, they don't combine, when they're collecting this pollen, they don't combine it with nectar. So it's called a dry pollen. So they're kind of messy, which makes a better pollinator, because then they go to the next flower and it comes off. And the honeybee, it's like, nope, I'm taking these baskets of pollen back to my hive. So they're not as interested in the pollination process. And also, mason bees kind of go back and forth to different trees, and sometimes honeybees will stay in one tree first. So mason bees are excellent at the cross-pollination. So there's different figures, but the last one I read today was 300 mason bees can do the work of, for pollination, 90,000 honeybees. 300 to 90,000. But there's different, no matter where you look. I mean, that's a little hard. But that tells you they're so efficient. They do not live very long. So after they emerge, they're probably around for 6 weeks or so. So they're not around very long. So it's only those early blooming trees. And unlike honeybees, because they have their hive, they're easy to move around. So, and then honeybees also function probably at a much wider spectrum of temperature. So, honeybees are great for so many things. But mason bees, I think you're going to hear more and more about it. And there's a mason bee society, and they have mason bee conferences. Yeah. And just so if you get a bee box, I know someone talked about that, you don't need to buy these. They're already out there. So we wondered, we put up our bee box, and like within, I don't know, how long did it take, Paul? Like a couple weeks, and all of a sudden, they found it. So leafcutter bees and mason bees both, they'll find the box. Mason bees want a little bit bigger hole than the leafcutter bees. Actually, they're very picky, but that's another story. But they're pretty cool. And this is an example of a bee box that was made out of bamboo. And that was what we had the first time that we realized you need to have something that you can clean out, because you can't use those but a couple years, and then you have a problem with insects and disease building up. But anyway, I just love that. And then you can see down below, it's a mason bee because it uses mud, some of the chambers that have already been filled. And these tubes are the ideal is about 6 inches long. It needs to have something on the end. And then they'll put multiple eggs in that. Again, there's the honeybee with the pollen sac, the wet pollen, and the mason bee with the messy pollen. So one of the things about bees is, besides the way they live in different types of communities and the way their anatomy is a little different. So some bees are called generalists, and if they have the right type of tongue and they can get to the nectar and the pollen, they'll go to a lot of flowers. And then there's some bees that are called specialists, and the squash bee is one of these. And it's a really interesting history of watching as people moved squash, pumpkin plants up north from Mexico, the squash bees followed along. And so, and the squash bees will only go to a flower in that family. So it has to be a pumpkin or a squash. This looks like a butternut squash. And so they're very focused on that. And then these flowers are really fascinating. So they have a male and a female flower. So we have the male on the left and the female on the right. So you have to have a bee that knows to go to both. And then if you've grown squash or pumpkins, so they'll open early in the morning when it's not hot, and then they'll wilt, right? Okay, so not all bees are out and about. The flower might be already wilted. Not the squash bees, they know, and they're in there right away early in the morning. So about the only way you'll ever see them is if you go out kind of early and look for them. And so there's one on the male flower and a couple hanging out in the female flower. And there are other bees that might, pollinate squash plants, but if you have these, you're going to be in a lot better shape. And it's kind of like, this is their ground nest. So if you provide some space near your pumpkin patch, your squash vines, some bare ground that they like, then they'll build nests because they like to be close to the plants. And then this is the other version of the carpenter bees. Definitely not as beefy as the large one and can't do quite as much. And they will look for stems that are already broken because they can't quite chew a lot of wood. But I think they're pretty cool. And look how tiny they are. It's pretty small. This is a mining bee that builds in the ground, loaded up with pollen. And then this is the longhorn bee that was on the sunflower picture that Kristen had sent. So the bee on the right is a female. Look at all the pollen she's collected. And the one on the left, I believe, is the male. So the male has longer antennae, and I don't really see pollen on that bee, so I'm thinking that's the male. They come out late in the summer, so sunflowers, you know, bloom late. Asters bloom late, so they're one of the very latest bees you'll see. And they're pretty durable, too. So some places you'll see them in October, November. Probably not Blaine County, but other places, yes. I think they're pretty cool. And this is just so you can get a size comparison. Now, the carpenter bee and the bumblebee aren't here, but you can see how some of these bees are pretty small compared to a honeybee. And they're easy to miss. So bees, being good pollinators, one of the things that's really neat about bees is there's so much diversity in bees that some bees come out early in the season. They can, you know, move around when it's like in the 50s or mid-50s. Other bees do great when it's hot. So, I mean, it's a neat thing because there's so many types of bees that they kind of cover a lot. And then, of course, the anatomy helps too. So one of the coolest adaptations, I think, and I'm sure a lot of you know about this because you've gone to the gardening classes, is bumblebees do what's called buzz pollinate. So they go up to one of these flowers in the potato family, whether it's tomato or pepper, and they actually tip over the flower. They're hanging on it and they tip it over and they start getting their wing muscles to start vibrating. It's like almost like a salt shaker, so they actually are able to get the pollen out. And honeybees can't do that. Just saying. There are a few other bees that can do it, but honeybees cannot. I still like honey. So. And again, you know, some of the bees, long-tongued or short-tongued, they go to different flowers. And bees only eat pollen and nectar. Pollen's an amazing protein source for the larva. And the nectar, it's kind of like, you know, it's what they use for energy because it's carbohydrate and water. The other thing that's cool about bees is some plants have what are called floral oils and then resins from trees. Some of them will collect that and then they combine it with their bee bread, which when the larva eats it, some of it is helps them to withstand some bacteria and some, you know, kind of gives them good health. The other thing they use some of the oils and the resins for, especially the resins, is, you know, those ground nesting bees. You got to protect against water, right? There's a bee called the cellophane bee that collects a resin specifically and uses its mandibles, and it packs the tunnel with this stuff and it waterproofs their little chamber. So it's important if you want to attract, you know, bees and help them, is they need, as soon as they emerge in the spring, they need a good source of pollen as well as nectar. And surprisingly, one of the very best forms here is to plant male willows, which are the willows that are like the pussy willows. Not the female has nectar, but only the male has the pollen. And so they'll be looking for that. And that's one of the first things that opens. And also I know some of the bulbs, we have found a lot of bees love the crocus, some of the crocus bulbs. And I know people like to leave their dandelions, but there's other things that are better than dandelion pollen. So thinking about planting or having something available all seasons, through the summer and then later into the fall, like the asters and all that. And there's a lot of native plants here that are spectacular. People don't really like them. They don't really want to put them in the yard, but like the rabbit brush and so there's a lot of native plants that are really good for the fall. And when you plant flowers, put them in patches. It helps them. They won't have to go as far if you have a patch of the same type of flower. And then herbs are great. I mean, I love native plants, but sometimes you have to just find something that works, that's easy to get, that you can plant. They, especially the small bees love when the herbs have flowered. And if you have enough space, clover's great. That helps them. And I put limit pesticide use. I really wanted to say no pesticide use. But what you really have to watch out for is, unfortunately, a lot of nursery plants are treated with systemics. Those systemics go through the whole plant. It'll be in the pollen and the nectar, and a lot of times because they're systemic, they'll last a long time. They might be in the soil. Be very careful. And seeds. Seeds are now treated that way. I think the bulk, not that bees go to corn, but I think most of the seeds planted in cornfields are all treated. So, and I never can say it, but it's up there. Neonicotinoids. So, there is a lot of pesticides that is based from that. I think the reason it was developed is it's from nicotine, and apparently it's better for people. It's not as dangerous for us. However, when you kill the bees, that is not good. So you have to be very cautious. And the companies that, I'm not going to say a lot, but the companies that make those, they make a lot of money. So they're strong lobbyists. Let's just put that out there. When you're providing for homes for bees, you could, of course, buy bee boxes, but there's a lot of simpler things you can do, too, and there's less maintenance. Like I said, leaving bare soil. Don't use mulch everywhere. Just, maybe there's some places you need to mulch. Don't till really deeply where you think there might be bees, and no pesticides in the soil. There's a lot of things that are sold because people, they want to get rid of the cutworms or something. So none of that, because that's going to be a problem. Cavity nesters, if it's a safe type of tree that you feel like you can leave a snag or part of a snag. Build brush piles, rock piles, and when you have perennials in your garden, leave at least 15 inches of that. Because remember, a lot of those bees are small and they're looking for a way to get into a small stem. And don't clean out the garden until all your bees have come out. So some bees don't come out until almost midsummer. So, yeah. And then you can build nesting boxes for bumblebees, mason bees, but they need to be taken care of. This is our mason bee community. So Paul he's built a lot of these. So we've tried different things. So we've had everything from, we modified a Costco box on the left, and then he made some inserts. And then the one that's closed, you can't see it, but there's like, you can open it and there's plexiglass and they're supposed to come in. You're supposed to be able to look at them, but they don't always find those. And then these two ones with the big holes, those are the emergent boxes that we put out with the tubes that we've stored through the winter. We put them in there. And then a really simple thing is go to the store and buy the tallest juice cans that are like 6 inches. And then on the right, we have a combination of tubes you can buy that are the right width. And then also I've been cutting some of the stems from the daylilies, you know, and they seem to, if they're big enough, they use those. So we're going to try and work on him, my husband, to do a whole talk on mason bees. All right, and then, so bees, they have to, there's a lot trying to get at them. Let's just put it that way. So here's a little crab spider. Do you see I think it's a honeybee that it's gotten. So these spiders will hang out in the flower. Sometimes they'll just be underneath and they'll watch. Oh yeah, and yeah, so, and they're fast. And that cute little bee fly that we saw the picture of, so they will actually go and lay their egg. I can't remember if it's in the egg of the bee. So then it emerges and eats the pollen and eats the bee larva. So there's lots of scavengers, animals, especially these ground bees, they'll go after like bumblebee nest. There's kind of some fungi that's a problem, and if you're, especially in the ground, there's always that issue with some moisture. Mites are bad, but then they also carry bacteria and virus. And then kleptoparasites are actually another bee that's really lazy. I don't know, maybe they're not that lazy, but I think they are. So bumblebees, there's cuckoo bumblebees, and they'll go in, and if the queen bumblebee's in there, it'll kill it, and then it'll lay its egg and then use all the resources the other bumblebee has gathered. So the reason you can tell, like if you can tell there's a bee and it's a female bee without pollen, it's taken advantage of another bee's hard work. And then cuckoo wasps, I believe those are the ones that will, they're kind of like a parasite too, and lay their egg in a larva. Root maggot, flesh flies, oh boy. And then sometimes people can be a problem. So these are just some ideas. First, look around. What kind of habitat do you already have for pollinators? And it could be any pollinator, so it doesn't have to be just bees. What seems to be working? And then protect that. Maybe work on providing some new areas, new plants, new nesting locations, and manage it just to minimize disturbance to the pollinators. So, okay, Lisa. So Lisa's got a handout with some resources. I don't know what time it is. Okay, good, we have time for questions. So on that resource sheet, I didn't put these three. I apologize. I forgot to. I found some great stuff, and we could always email you those too. So on this resource sheet, there are the books that are available at the library, as well as I believe some others. There's some great websites, and then I made some copies of some of the items on the resource sheet so you can see what's out there. There's just some really cool materials. And one of the websites I really like, because they have great information, you can actually buy some cool stuff, is www.pollinator.org, which is on your resource sheet. An amazing website, and because of all the things that they do to try and protect bees and other pollinators, is xerce.org. So I didn't have it on the list, but has anyone heard of Robert Michael Pyle, the author? Good for, I know. So this was actually one of the people that really was inspiring to me. He actually was a founder of xerces.org. He's written lots of amazing books. This one of the books is on chasing monarchs. And he actually physically tried to follow monarchs. And anyway, he's a great guy. So, and I think that's it. So, questions? Oh. What?
So much information.
I know. I think they're so cool.
So I'm wondering on the nicotinoids, or however you say that.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a way to read on the seed packets if it has that in it?
I think they're supposed to state it. Now, one of the resources that you can get from, oh shoot, let me look at this. It's on your sheet. So, beyondpesticides.org they have information. There's a handout here that actually lists all the names that they use, when you buy something. I think they're supposed to have something on those seeds. I'm not positive. I should know. So it's really, I think they've come a long way. I think even some of the hardware stores or the lumber yards have actually gotten better about the plants they carry. But you just have to be very careful. And it's amazing. They've only been out since, I believe, the 1990s, and they figure they're probably one of the main reasons so many species are just crashing. And I would assume probably maybe even birds, because if birds are eating larvae that's on a tree that's been sprayed, then most likely there's a problem. And sometimes those pesticides, there might be just a little bit of, maybe it's not a whole big dose, so it may not kill a bee, but what it does is it influences its ability to forage for pollen and to provide a good nest. So there's other ways that it's impacting the bees.
So what can you tell us about the the bees that cross the country to pollinate various crops? Millions of them in big trucks, and they go to the ones I'm most familiar with are the almond groves in California. So what kind of bees are those? And they're crashing as well, as I understand.
They're honeybees.
They're honeybees.
They're all honeybees, and again, honeybees, they do have the benefit of they can pollinate from 60 degrees to over 100. And because they're in these large hives, there's always something blooming, so they kind of move them around. I don't think the only other one that is used kind of commercially, the mason bees are starting to be used commercially, but they don't move them around, I don't believe. I think they only set up nesting boxes near the orchards. But bumblebees, and they're not the native bumblebees, are used in greenhouses. So they use, I think it's the eastern bumblebee. So they actually put them in greenhouses to pollinate, again, the tomatoes, something that The problem with that is it's nice they're using bumblebees, but if they escape, then there's kind of some concern about does that weaken the native bumblebees in an area?
Do bees vary depending on, you know, where in the country you are? Are the populations different in different parts of the country, or have they all kind of homogenized?
Oh, they're really different, yeah. And it's goes back to, if you don't look at honeybees, you know, but if you look at just the native bees in certain locations, they are where they are because the flowers that they prefer are there. Now, the mason bees, they go to the flowers in the rose family. So, like apples are in the rose family. So I think, I didn't say this earlier, but the honeybees, when they were brought over in the 1600s from England and Europe, but probably mostly from England, they brought them because they wanted the wax and they wanted the honey. And I think they also thought maybe they would help, you know, with fruit trees. What they probably didn't realize, there were already a lot of native bees that would do it. And they're realizing a lot of places where they help the habitat for native bees, crops do so much better than just depending on honeybees. So, you know, doing some things, some corridors to help sustain the native bees really helps the whole farm. I did bring a little sample. One of the bee tubes I brought, unfortunately, we opened it up, and so something had been in there. So, getting the little larva, but there is one tube back there that's in a lily stem, so you can kind of see some of the chambers, kind of give you an idea. Oh, yes. Well, once they're used, we just get rid of it. Yeah, we don't reuse yeah. But, yeah, that's, okay.
Linda,
Yes.
You were rattling off so many different kinds of bees, lots of wonderful pictures. Are most of the ones you talked about native to this area? Okay,
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, they are. And one of the books back there, at least a couple of the books, are just fantastic. I think it's The Bees of North America. Anyway, it's probably more information than you want, but they're just amazing. So, and I like the book too because there's so much natural history too. So there is a bee a small bee, they didn't even really know about it. It's in southern Utah. There's a flower that was kind of put on an endangered list, very rare flower. And they were trying to figure out how to restore that flower. And then they realized there was a pollinator, a bee, that went to that flower. And once they figured that out, they're working on nurturing that bee to bring back the flowers. And I think that's a great example